What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
My parents paid for my sister's dream wedding, every last detail, from the kind of dress you only see in bridal magazines, to a reception in a place where even the cheapest dinner plate costs more than most people spend on a week's groceries, to a honeymoon package that looked like it was pulled from a luxury travel ad. It was the kind of event that gets talked about for years, with everyone posting pictures and gushing over how perfect everything was. When it was my turn to get married, a few years earlier, I was told gently but firmly that they couldn't afford to contribute much, and that it was best for me and my fiancé to keep things simple and practical. I believed them because I had no reason not to. I took them at their word, thinking maybe the economy was bad, or their savings had taken a hit, or they were just not in a position to help. I got married in a small courthouse ceremony, with a dinner afterward that my husband and I paid for ourselves. I told myself it didn't matter, that what counted was the marriage, not the celebration. But the thing is, it does matter, not because of the flowers or the music or the food, but because it's about the way you're valued, the way your family shows up for you. And when they didn't, I made peace with it, or at least I thought I had. Then I saw the bill for my sister's honeymoon. It was sitting out on the kitchen counter at my parents' house when I stopped by one afternoon to drop off something they'd asked for. I didn't go looking for it, I wasn't snooping, it was just there, a glossy invoice with numbers so big they looked almost fake. At first, I told myself maybe she and her new husband had paid for it themselves, but the words "paid in full," "parent account," stared back at me like a punch in the face. In that moment, I felt a kind of cold settle in that I can't really explain. It wasn't just about money, it was about everything it represented. They hadn't just decided to give her something they couldn't give me, they'd chosen to give her something they had told me didn't even exist for either of us. When I confronted my mom about it later that week, her tone was casual, as if I was being unreasonable for even bringing it up. She said, "Well, your situation was different. You were older, you didn't want all that fuss, and you could afford to do your own thing. Plus, your sister always dreamed about this. We wanted her to have it." She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like there was no possible way I could take it as hurtful or unfair. I remember just standing there, listening, and realizing that she genuinely didn't see what was wrong with it. My dad chimed in with something about timing and circumstances, and how I should be happy for my sister instead of comparing. Comparing? They were the ones who set the comparison by giving her a blank check and me a pat on the back. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like my sister was the favorite, but it was the first time it was this blatant, this undeniable, this out in the open. And it was humiliating, because it made me see how many times over the years I'd let them treat me like the dependable one, the one who didn't need the extra help, the one who could handle things on her own, while she got to be the one they spoiled and protected. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was the pattern. I thought about the time I took time off work to watch my sister's kids because she needed a break, and my parents said I was being such a good sister, but when I asked them for help during a move, they were too busy. I thought about the family holidays where she was praised for simply showing up, while my contributions were treated as expected. The wedding was just the clearest, loudest example of a truth I'd been trying not to admit. I didn't say much to them that day, and that was deliberate. The old me would have argued, tried to make them see my side, maybe even cried. But in that moment, I knew something they didn't. I wasn't going to keep playing this role. I was done being the one who swallowed her feelings so everyone else could stay comfortable. I left their house that day without slamming the door, without raising my voice, without letting them see that anything had changed. But inside, something huge had shifted. The dynamic we'd had my entire life had just ended, though they wouldn't know it for a while. A few days later, when I attended the brunch they hosted before my sister and her husband left for their honeymoon, I noticed how easy it was to smile, to laugh, to let them think I was fine. My sister was glowing, not from love, but from the attention, the way everyone fussed over her. She made a couple of digs about my tiny little wedding, as if she couldn't help herself. My parents laughed along, pretending it was just sisterly teasing, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I let her talk, I let them nod, and I sat there thinking about the invoice on the kitchen counter and about how much it had really cost me to keep pretending this family operated on love and fairness. That brunch was the last time I sat at a family table without knowing exactly what I was going to do next. They thought I was just being quiet because I was tired or distracted, but in my head, I was already taking stock of everything I needed to untangle. It was a long list, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be final. I didn't know exactly when the right moment would come, but I knew I wouldn't wait long. And as I watched them clink their glasses to new beginnings for my sister, I realized they had no idea mine had already started. A few days after the brunch, when I thought the whole wedding spectacle was finally behind us, my mom called and invited me over for dinner, saying they wanted to spend some quality time before things get busy again, which I found almost laughable considering that the only thing they seemed busy with lately was basking in the afterglow of my sister's fairy tale wedding and preparing for her upcoming honeymoon. I knew instinctively that this wasn't just about dinner. My parents are not the type to do anything without a subtext, but I went anyway. Partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to see just how far they'd go to justify themselves now that there was no hiding what they had done. When I arrived, the atmosphere was strangely casual, as though the last conversation about the honeymoon invoice had never happened. My dad poured me a glass of wine like he always did, my mom asked me about work, and for the first 15 minutes, it was all surface-level small talk. Then, without even trying to disguise it as anything else, my mom started talking about how happy she was that my sister's wedding had gone so smoothly, how proud she was that they had been able to give her that special day, and how she knew that someday my sister would look back and remember it as one of the best moments of her life. She didn't say it outright, but the implication was crystal clear. They believed their choice had been the right one, and any lingering resentment I might have felt was simply me not appreciating their perspective. When I gently reminded them that I had also gotten married, and that their approach to my wedding had been, well, a little different, my mom gave me the kind of look she usually reserved for when I was being difficult, a mix of pity and annoyance, and said, "Honey, your situation wasn't the same. You and Mark didn't want a big wedding, you didn't need all that. We've talked about this." My dad added his usual line about how things were tighter back then, and how we didn't want you to start your marriage with debt. And, just like that, they had reframed their lack of contribution as some sort of selfless, protective act, as though depriving me of the same support they had lavished on my sister was actually for my own good. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, because they weren't just defending their actions, they were rewriting history in real time, and they expected me to nod along and be grateful. My sister, who had apparently decided to drop by midway through dinner, didn't waste a second before making it worse. She walked in, kissed my parents on the cheek, and then smirked at me while saying something about how she'd been recovering from the exhaustion of her big day and how she didn't know how I'd managed to plan my own wedding without collapsing from the stress, considering how small mine had been. It was meant to be a joke, but it landed like a jab, and my parents chuckled in that awkward way that tells you they know it's a little mean, but they're not going to call it out because, deep down, they agree. I felt the familiar urge to defend myself rise up, to remind her that I hadn't been given the same resources, to point out that I'd worked full-time and still managed to pull off something meaningful, to call out my parents for letting her talk to me like that in their own home. But this time, I didn't. I swallowed it, not because I was intimidated or hurt in the way I used to be, but because I realized that saying anything would only give them the satisfaction of watching me react, of confirming that they still had the power to get under my skin. I didn't want them to see my anger. I wanted them to see nothing at all. Instead, I asked my sister how her packing for the honeymoon was going, and she launched into a long-winded description of her new designer luggage and the surprise my dad had promised her at the airport. I kept my face neutral, but in my head, every detail she let slip was fuel. I thought about how often they had told me we're all about fairness, when I was growing up, how they claimed to treat us equally, and how those words now felt like the kind of empty slogan a company uses when they know their employees are miserable, but they want to keep up appearances. I thought about the times I'd been called independent and self-sufficient, as though those were rewards instead of labels they used to excuse not showing up for me the way they did for her. By the end of dinner, I wasn't even pretending to be engaged in the conversation anymore. I was watching them the way you watch strangers in a public place, observing without attachment. They didn't notice. My mom hugged me at the door and said she was glad we were all on the same page now, as if this evening had been about closure instead of her absolving herself of any guilt. My dad patted my shoulder and told me to be happy for your sister. It's her time to shine, as if I had spent my life hogging the spotlight and now needed to step aside. My sister just waved and told me she'd send me photos from the trip, as though I had been begging for updates. I got in my car and sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine, not because I was upset in the way they might have expected, but because I knew, right then and there, that I had no interest in repairing this relationship. I didn't want them to understand me, I didn't want them to apologize, and I didn't want to wait for them to change. I wanted out clean, permanent, without any dramatic confrontation they could later spin as me being emotional. I knew that in order to do that, I'd have to start quietly, without raising suspicion, and the moment they left for that honeymoon would be the perfect opportunity. As I drove away, I thought about the irony of it. They believed they were keeping me close by involving me in their little family dinners and treating me like the quiet, steady one, when in reality, they were giving me every reason to walk away and never look back. What they didn't know, and what I had no intention of telling them, was that I had already begun untangling myself from every single tie that bound me to them. And by the time they noticed, it would be far too late to do anything about it. I went home from that dinner and did something I should have done years ago, which was sit down with a blank sheet of paper and write, without filters and without the usual family slogans, every single thing that tied me to them in any way that gave them leverage or allowed them to pretend they were doing me favors while I quietly carried the real weight, and the list that came out wasn't pretty or noble or sentimental. It was practical and blunt, and it told the truth in a way none of us had said out loud before, because when I read it back I could see how often I had been the backup plan, the emergency contact, the free babysitter, the second wallet, the spare car. The person who could be counted on to step in so someone else could be praised for simply showing up. I started with money, not because I worship it, but because money is where people show you what they value. So I wrote down the so-called family emergency fund my parents had talked me into contributing to when I was fresh out of college and still naive enough to believe that we were building something together. A fund that somehow only ever seemed to be there when my sister needed a down payment for a car or a deposit for an apartment, and I opened the old statements and highlighted every transfer from my account with the dates and amounts and the notes I had written back then about doing the right thing, and then I looked at the current balance and realized that there was still enough sitting there to pretend the fund existed. And I felt a kind of calm come over me as I walked into my bank the next morning, closed the joint access that had my name on it, and withdrew exactly what I had put in over the years, not a dollar more, because I wasn't stealing from anyone. I was taking back what was mine and leaving them with the story they loved to tell about fairness, while the numbers finally reflected the truth. Next came the administrative ties, the subtle ones that look like love but function like control. So I opened the file where I keep my documents and changed my beneficiaries and my emergency contacts. Because I had put my mother's name on everything out of habit and because it felt like the normal thing to do, and in one afternoon I rewrote every form so that if something happened to me the call would go to someone who actually answered when I needed them. And I updated my health records too. Remove permissions they never used except when it made them look involved. And I requested a copy of my birth certificate and social security records so they would never again be able to hold a box in their attic over my head with the suggestion that my papers were safe with them. Then I dealt with the recurring burdens that had been dressed up as family generosity, like the phone plan they had once put me on to help with cost, which I later discovered was being billed to my card because they had used my credit to get a lower rate. So I ported my number out, closed the payment profile, and scheduled the plan to terminate right after their flight departed, so there would be no dramatic showdown and no last-minute bargaining, just a quiet click as a door they thought was propped open for them swung shut, and I did the same with the streaming accounts and the cloud storage and the family calendar that I alone kept updated, because apparently it was my job to make sure grown adults remembered birthdays, dentist appointments, and school pickups. Housing was the one they assumed chained me to them, because they had co-signed my lease years ago when my credit was thin, and then treated that signature as if it was a permanent lien on my independence. So I pulled out the lease, read the assignment clause 3 times, and then drove to the property manager's office to negotiate a clean exit that would not leave me exposed. And what I found was that if I paid the early termination fee and cleared the unit without damage, they would release me and keep the guarantors listed for the remainder of the term until the unit was relet, which meant that for once the paper chain they loved actually looped around their own wrists, and I signed the notice with a steady hand, booked the inspection, and scheduled the movers for the morning my parents and my sister were due at the airport. Work was simpler than I expected because I had been good at my job for a long time, so when I asked my manager about transferring to the partner office in a different city and starting a few weeks earlier than planned, she said yes without drama. And I used my saved vacation to disappear from the old office a little sooner than anyone had anticipated, and I updated my payroll to a bank they didn't know, opened a new post office box, and routed every piece of mail that mattered away from the address they had memorized and into a space that belonged only to me, and I did all of it without a single announcement, because I was done making speeches for people who treated my explanations like interruptions to their narrative. The personal side required the kind of discipline that used to scare me, which was to stop volunteering for anything that made their lives easier at the cost of mine. So I deleted the text chain where my sister dropped last-minute childcare requests like grenades. I declined 3 invitations to family nights with the kind of polite but firm language that doesn't require a debate, and I stopped sending the long, thoughtful messages I used to send after every slight in the hope that someone would finally hear me, because I wasn't interested in being heard anymore. I was interested in being free, and freedom sounds like silence when you've lived your whole life explaining yourself. There was one more line on the list that I hesitated over, not because it was illegal or cruel, but because it felt like the first time I would send a signal they couldn't ignore. And that was the question of the gifts I had financed for them over the years that they kept in their home while implying they had paid for everything themselves. So I pulled the receipts for the washer and dryer I had bought when their old set died, for the tools in the garage they used whenever something broke, for the table they swore had been a family heirloom when in fact it was a purchase I made because I wanted them to have a nice place to sit, and I called a hauling service to pick up what I could legally prove I owned, coordinated the pickup for the day after they left, and left the rest because I wasn't trying to strip them bare. I was just drawing a line that said, very clearly, if I pay for it and I need it, it goes with me. By the end of the week, the list had turned into appointments and confirmations, and every confirmation felt like a layer coming off that I hadn't realized I was wearing. So when the email came from the landlord confirming receipt of my notice and the inspection date, and the bank notice verified my withdrawals and account closures, and the HR portal showed my new start date and my updated contacts, I looked at the calendar where my mother had added the note about my sister's honeymoon send-off. And I added a private event of my own for the same morning that simply said, move, and I stared at the 2 words side by side, theirs and mine, and understood that while they were boarding a plane to celebrate the person they had always chosen, I would be walking out of a door they believed they owned and locking it behind me for good. As for revenge, I didn't need a shouted confrontation or a spectacle to make it real, because the first real strike landed the moment I walked into the bank and took back my contributions from that family fund they had used like a valve that only opened in one direction. And I left a single line in the paper ledger that used to sit in my mother's kitchen drawer, a line that read, withdrew my portion, no hard feelings, do not contact, and I tucked that ledger back exactly where I had found it. Because when they opened it after their trip and tried to explain the math to themselves, the numbers would be the ones doing the talking. When I folded the list and slipped it into my bag, there was nothing left on it that wasn't already scheduled or completed, and the relief hit me in a way that didn't feel triumphant so much as solid and final, like a door closing softly but permanently. And as I set my alarm for the morning they were due to head to the airport, I realized that by the time they texted me from the gate with the usual expectant commentary about how excited they were, there would be nothing for me to reply from. No shared plan to reference, no address to use as a leash, and no version of me on the other end who still needed their approval to breathe. The morning my parents drove my sister to the airport for the start of her 2-week honeymoon, I woke up before dawn with the kind of steady focus that only shows up when you have already made every decision and all that is left is execution. So I made coffee, opened my calendar, checked the confirmations for the movers, the locksmith, the hauling service, the lease inspection, and the mail forwarding, and then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb because I didn't want the vibration of anyone else's mood to interfere with the last clean stretch between me and the life I had decided to claim. I had staged my essentials the night before in labeled bins, not because I cared about the labels, but because order keeps the panic out, and I watched the movers carry out the first box with an odd calm, knowing that with each trip down the stairs some invisible cord loosened, and the place that had never truly felt like mine because their names sat on the lease like fingerprints would stop pretending to claim me back. By mid-morning the hauling truck arrived for the items I had receipts for, which meant there was no dramatic conversation to be had and no debate to stage, just a polite handoff and a signature, and as the washer and dryer rolled out, along with the toolbox that had been my so-called gift to the family during a crisis and then quietly treated as communal property ever since, I felt a dull satisfaction that wasn't about payback so much as balance restored. The kind of balance that appears when you refuse to keep underwriting other people's lives under the banner of love while your own stands in line for permission. The property manager walked through at noon for the pre-inspection and looked surprised in the way managers do when a tenant has done the math, paid the fee, patched the holes, and vacuumed the corners. And when she signed off on the condition and confirmed the key drop protocol and the final meter readings, I could feel the lease turn from a leash into a dead piece of paper that no longer held any story about me, and I thanked her like I would thank a clerk at a post office, because this was a transaction, not a therapy session. The locksmith met me at the storage unit instead of the apartment because there was nothing left to lock there that mattered to me, and he rekeyed what would now be the only door with my name behind it while I sat on a folding chair and updated the last of my account passwords, and I realized that control doesn't look like a speech or a showdown. It looks like a stack of confirmations with your new address on them and no one else's name anywhere on the page. My manager from the new office called to say the transfer paperwork had cleared and my start date was set for early the following week, and when she asked if I needed more time, I almost laughed. Because time was the only thing I had been denied for years under a rotating carousel of family emergencies, and now I had given myself an uninterrupted stretch that belonged to me and me alone, which felt both ordinary and revolutionary. I drove one last load to the new place in the late afternoon, checked the mailbox with the new key, and found the first envelope with my name cleanly printed by a machine that did not know my mother's handwriting, and it hit me how much of growing up, at least for me, was choosing which doors get to know your name, so I set the envelope on the counter and stood in the quiet and felt nothing dramatic, just a clarity that did not need witnesses. Then I went back to the old apartment for the final pass-through, wiped the counters, filled the small nail holes with the same patience I used to bring to fixing other people's messes, and left the place as empty as the excuses I had finally stopped accepting. And on the kitchen counter I placed the only thing I wasn't taking with me, which was the envelope I had typed in a plain font and sealed without flourish, addressed to my parents, because I knew that whatever I said in person would be performed and dismissed, while whatever they read alone would have to echo without me there to soften it. The timing was precise by design, so that the minute their plane crossed into a different time zone, the family phone plan I had been secretly paying the largest share of would split, and my number would stand on its own. The cloud storage I had organized would revert to separate accounts. The streaming passwords they thought I was changing too often would stop working because I would no longer be the administrator. And the shared calendar that only ever seemed to matter when I was the one filling in the dates would go blank, which sounds petty unless you have lived being the unpaid project manager of people who call themselves a team, but never read the brief. I left the keys in the envelope the property manager had provided, snapped the photo she needed as proof, and slid the packet into the drop box with a finality that did not require anger, because anger is a leash too. And I was done wearing anything around my neck that was not my choice. On the way out, I placed one small box in the building's package room with a prepaid label addressed to my sister, containing the sentimental items she had once loaned me, with an attached note that said, in as few words as possible, that I was returning these out of respect for their meaning to her and would not be responsible for holding on to anything for safekeeping anymore, which was not meant as a jab so much as a boundary written in a language she could not mistake for an invitation. I turned my phone off for the evening, not because I feared missing anything but because I wanted to feel the clean line of silence, and I drove to my new place without checking messages, and when I plugged the phone in and powered it back on much later, there were no missed calls yet, only a scheduled text from my bank confirming the final closure of the joint account and the successful transfer of my own funds into the new institution where I had opened an account under only my name, and the relief I felt was not exhilarating. It was grounded, the way finishing a long and boring but necessary task can feel like a personal holiday. For the revenge that belonged to this day, I had set it up so that the leasing office would send the guarantor notice to the address on file, which meant the people who had used their signature as a moral claim on my choices would now receive, in their own mailbox, a carefully worded letter acknowledging that the unit had been vacated by the tenant and that any remaining obligations under the guarantee would continue until a new tenant was secured, which was less about punishing them and more about ending the story. They told where their support was a gift I owed them gratitude for forever. Now the paperwork would explain, in neutral language, that support is a contract with terms and an end. And as for the letter on the counter, which I had sealed before I could be tempted to revise it into something polite, it did not say goodbye, and it did not ask for understanding. It listed, without blame and without decoration, the ways I had participated in a family system that rewarded one child for needing and penalized the other for coping, and it ended with a single line that would either be read as cruel or as merciful depending on which of them opened it first, a line that said I would not be reachable on the numbers they had, that any mail sent to my old address would be returned, and that there would be no meeting to discuss this because I was not negotiating my exit. I locked the new door, slid the chain into place, and sat on the floor with my back against a wall that had no history of my name being spoken, with a sigh, and I listened to the air in a home where no one expected me to apologize for wanting what I give other people. And while I didn't sleep easily, I didn't worry either, because every piece had been set exactly where it needed to be, and the only thing left in motion was the envelope waiting like a small, plain detonator on a countertop I had wiped clean, and when they stepped back into town and picked up their phones and found silence where my number used to be, that little square of paper would do what I had never managed to do with my voice. It would end the story. They landed on a Sunday evening, the kind of hour when people come home tired and satisfied and ready to post the last batch of photos, and I know this not because I checked their flight or tracked them like I used to track everyone's needs, but because my mother's friend mistakenly sent a group text to the old family thread that still had my number cached, a small digital echo that reached my phone as silence, because the thread no longer existed where they thought it did, and while that might sound petty from the outside, to me it felt like the proof I needed that I had finally stepped out of a chorus I had been singing in since childhood without ever liking the song. What I also know, because the events were timed with the predictability of office mail, is that the guarantor notice from the leasing office would have been waiting in their mailbox when they pulled into the driveway. A neutral envelope with tidy language stating that the unit under my former lease had been vacated in good order and that the guarantee obligations would continue only until re-rented, which meant a switch had flipped in a place they could not argue with, because paper does not care about family narratives. And for once the moral fog they liked to spray over every practical question would have nowhere to stick. I imagine my mother saw the envelope I left on the old kitchen counter before anything else, because she is the sort of person who cannot ignore a thing with her name on it, and I do not need to picture her opening it in order to explain what was inside. Because I wrote it and sealed it and did not soften it, and it was not a speech and not an apology and not a plea. It was a one-page ledger of what I had done for this family over the years, and not the sentimental tasks that can be reinterpreted in a warm light, but the hard list with dates and amounts and hours, the babysitting so a work trip could happen, the Monday mornings I covered because the Sunday nights had gotten out of hand, the wire transfers labeled short-term That turned into long-term disappearances in our shared story. The hospital pickup at dawn after a minor procedure where I waited in a lobby and then drove in silence, while being told I was dramatic for looking tired. The credit check I allowed for the sake of a better rate, and the years of hearing about how grateful I should be for the privilege of being included. At the bottom, I wrote one sentence that did not blink. You have had your dream of how this family should work, and I have carried it for long enough. I am done. People always want to know whether there was yelling after that, whether my phone exploded with calls, whether someone came to my door, and the answer is disappointingly quiet, which is exactly what I planned for. Because the phones that rang were attached to lines I no longer used, the addresses they had memorized now pointed to a place where the keys belonged to a property manager who did not forward nonsense. And the email that once lit up my weekends was now a filter that sent anything with my family's last name straight to an archive I do not open, and if that sounds cold, you should know that cold is what remains when warmth has been rationed to one person for so long that everyone else begins calling it balance. My sister did manage one message through a mutual friend, and it started with an accusation about me being ungrateful and ended with a demand that I explain myself, and the friend asked if I wanted to respond, and I said no. Not because I was afraid to talk, but because explanations are a currency I had overpaid with for years, and I had no intention of underwriting their comfort anymore. The practical fallout began to arrive on their side in the same steady rhythm that had brought me my freedom. The family phone account no longer included my subsidized line, and the bill reflected their usage alone. The cloud storage returned to individual ownership, which meant my careful backups of their photos did not exist as a safety net when their passwords failed. The family calendar stopped reminding them about the dentist and the school conference and the friend's birthday. And instead of me swooping in with the apologetic text and the rescheduling call, there was silence and a missed appointment fee, and while none of that is the stuff of movie vengeance, it is the kind of structural shift that makes people realize that a system they dismissed as invisible labor was in fact a spine. I also did one last thing that never made it into the envelope because it did not belong to them. It belonged to me, and that was to place a freeze on my credit with the bureaus. To revoke every old authorization and shred every stray application that had been sitting in a drawer for a rainy day someone kept predicting on my behalf, and I sent a letter to the bank that housed the so-called family emergency fund that explained, in the calmest terms possible, that the account had been closed with my portion withdrawn and that any inquiries should be directed to the remaining account holders, and I copied the letter to myself and filed it. Not because I expected a dispute, but because I have learned that documentation is the language people believe when they refuse to hear your voice. By the middle of the week, my new office issued a welcome badge with my new address in a city none of them had ever lived in, my paycheck deposited into a bank they could not casually mention at holidays, and my manager asked how I was settling in. And I said that I was more focused than I had been in years because I was not trying to do two jobs anymore, which is the delicate way of saying that being the family's crisis manager while also having an actual career is not a personality trait. It is a drain with nice manners. I bought a second-hand table with my own money and set it up with the patience I used to save for other people's errands, and I ate dinner without checking my phone because I no longer had to brace for the guilt text that arrives the minute you sit down. And I went to bed early knowing that no one would call at dawn to ask for a favor they had framed as a chance for me to prove my loyalty. As for whether they miss me or resent me or perform a new version of family that includes a diffused, flattering story about why I am not around, I do not know, and the truth is that I have built my days so that the question does not matter. Though I am not going to pretend there is no sting when I think about what could have been if they had chosen fairness when it was easy instead of nostalgia after the fact, because I am still a person who wanted a family that called love what it was instead of branding it as logistics. What I do know is that when I reach into my bag now, the list I once carried has been replaced by a small stack of keys, all of which open doors that belong to me alone. And when I think about the girl who accepted the courthouse and the quiet dinner and the careful gratitude because she believed the story about practicality, I understand her and forgive her. And I also know she would be proud that I stopped asking for permission to be valued. If there is a final move here, it is not the paper on the counter or the notice in their mailbox or the frozen credit or the blank calendar. It is the fact that I did not wait for them to understand me before I acted. And I did not leave any lever in their hands that could be pulled to make me come back and explain myself, and I did not turn my exit into a spectacle they could point to as proof that I am difficult or dramatic. I left them with what they trust most, which is the math, the bills that now reflect their usage, the accounts that no longer carry my name, the lease that proves signatures have endings, and the quiet that arrives when the person you assumed would always show up has put her energy into a life where showing up is not an apology but a choice. Whether they call that betrayal or boundaries is their business, and maybe someday there will be a version of this where we speak again, but I am not building toward that scene. I am building a life for the most shocking thing, after years of being told I was strong enough to carry it all, is that I finally put it down and walked away without asking anyone to clap.